Hello, everyone. My name is Ardo Omer. I am the Kids Coordinator at the Festival of Literary Diversity, aka The Fold. And welcome to today's Fold Academy workshop called a how-to on book reviews with me. Just so you guys know, the chat will be closed. And if you have any questions throughout the workshop or at the end, please put them in the Q&A box. And I will actually be answering questions. I wouldn't be asking questions. I'll be answering questions at the very end. So I won't be answering them throughout. So yeah, so it seems like we have a good group of people here, and it is time to get this workshop started. So let's do it. So I thought I'd start by talking a bit about myself and who I am and why I'm the one hosting this workshop. So I started writing articles for the online newspaper at my high school. And then I wrote a handful of articles for the various colleges within York University. So like Mac Media, the Vandu, etc. And I bring this up because there might be some young folks, teens, college age students who are watching and want to know how to get started in book reviewing. And this is some of the ways in which they can do that within the context of school. However, this workshop in general will actually look at the ways you can do that outside of school, which actually brings me to my book blog. So near the end of my second year at York University, I decided to get back into reading because I had actually stopped reading for pleasure to actually focus on post-secondary education. Like that was the decision high school Ardo made, and then realized that wasn't great. That wasn't a great decision for me. And so I actually started the blog initially to track my creative writing experience as a creative writing minor at York. And then it slowly morphed into writing reviews for books I was reading at the time. And so just some context, my book blog, I started that in 2012, which actually marks, like this 2022 marks 10 years since the first time I made that book blog. And around the time when I had started it, it was when 50 Shades of Grey was like massive. It was a book that everyone had some kind of opinion on. Which meant I also wanted to have an opinion on it. And then it kind of grew from there. It was also the beginning of the dystopian genre boom in young adult fiction as well around that time. Like that's when it started, like your Hunger Games and all of that started to be very popular. So the blog led to opportunities where I wrote for other sites for free. And we'll get into that later on in the workshop, but these sites were run by volunteers, and the experience there led to paid freelance opportunities for sites like Hyperallergenic, The Slate, The Toast, Teen Vogue, and Quill and Choir, the MNT, and currently a regular contributor at yeah, so if you guys can let me know if you can hear me during this, that would be great. You can maybe put a quick comment if you can hear me in the Q&A box. But I am unmuted at this point. So do let me know if you can't hear me. Okay, great. You guys can hear me. Thank you. Yeah, so, and then I'm now currently on top of my job at Fold as a kids coordinator. I kind of do something on the side, write reviews on the side. And one of those opportunities is the Canadian Children's Book News, where I write kidlit reviews. So I want to talk about, oh, still not be able to hear me. It might be on your end. If you can't hear me, it might be something on your end. But yes, who are reviews for? So that's the question that I'm here to talk about to start off with, because to write a review, it's important to understand why you're writing it. So like, who is your audience? This is a question even writers engage in. Actually, quite a bit of people in various fields kind of get into that when they're trying to communicate something in terms of who your audience is. This will help shape the review, especially during those moments when either you have so many thoughts and feelings about a book and you just don't know where to start, or there might be books that you want to review, but you just you don't know, you feel very neutral about them, so you don't really know where to come at it from. And so it's really helpful to know who your audience is. When I started my book blog, I never thought about that in terms of my audience. And it wasn't until I had some reviews under my belt and actually started talking to other book bloggers in the community, primarily through Twitter, that there were a lot of like industry conversations around like who book reviews are actually for. And so I thought, why not we like together as a group figure out who book reviews are for. So are book reviews for publishers? No. Book reviews are definitely not things that are created for a publisher. It's not about the publisher. The publisher will probably see a great review of their book and they'll share it and it's beneficial for them in that way. But in terms of writing that review with an audience in mind, it's definitely not the publisher and it shouldn't be the publisher. Is it for the author? No. Usually, especially if we're talking about a book that's already been published, the author can't really do anything with that review other than maybe improve later on in their own work, but truly it's not about them. There's been like some specific cases where maybe if the book is particularly problematic and an author is being told that it's problematic, there might be some leeway in which, you know, we haven't published the book yet, but advanced copies had already gone out. There might be room to change. There's like very like rare situations, but the reality is this book review is not going to be for the author. The author, if they want to engage in your review and check out your review, they'll do that on their own time, but they should never be the person you think about when you're writing your review. Is it for yourself? Partly yes, and this is important to understand. If it's because if you're not enjoying writing a review or the process of writing book reviews, then you shouldn't do it. Even if you've started doing it, if you're not getting joy out of it, then it's not something you should continue pursuing. But again, it's not really for you because then you would just put it in your diary, right? There is a reason why you are releasing this book review into the world. So who is it for? Readers, your fellow readers. Book reviews are for fellow readers to decide if a book is something they should read. In some cases, a really great review might be that final push. A reader needs to read the book, or maybe it was a book they never heard of or was really interested in, but your review kind of convinced them to check it out. On the other end of things, a reader might take a negative review and decide not to read it for that reason, partly because maybe they've been following your reviews and you guys have similar tastes. And so they're like, okay, this review is not for me. Or maybe the issues you took, maybe the issues the reviewer pointed out are issues that the reader is like, oh, I also don't want to really spend my time reading a book if it's filled with things that I'm not going to necessarily enjoy. That may feel harsh on the negative review side of things, but it's also important to note that there are hundreds of books published within like Canada alone. There are thousands and thousands of books being published in the English language, and even more so millions in other languages. And that doesn't even take into account books published like backlist titles. So titles published before, say, this current year, right? So like from last year until the creation of the printed word, right? And so book reviews kind of become an important way to sift through the noise and ideally lead readers to the books that work for them, right? Like they say, there's whenever a book is published, there's always an audience for that book. And another reason also is that fellow readers find book reviews useful because it's kind of like a conversation, right? They've read this book, they have all these feelings about this book, and they want to see if this reader has a similar, sorry, everyone. Okay, excellent. So there might be some technical difficulties in terms of hearing, and I apologize for that. And hopefully when we share this as a recorded piece, you'll be able to hear me as well. Let me just make sure all of this works. It seems to be. But again, and the other reason for why it's important for book readers, your fellow readers, is that they want to know, okay, does this person have a similar, like, are there people out there that have similar thoughts in terms of what they thought about this book, or maybe who has a differing opinion? And similar to it's kind of like a similar feeling you get when you're part of a book club, right? You have 1 week during a book club where everyone's on the same page and it's great and you're vibing. And then there's another week where you have such a wide array of thoughts on a book, which is also just as interesting. And so there's like a community aspect involved as well. So you know your audience and who a book review is for. So what makes a really good one? Well, context. It's really important to offer context to your readers. What do I mean by that? Well, what is the book about? That's probably the biggest importance of a book review. Like, you can't really get into the whys and why nots until you kind of explain what the book is about. This can be as easy as sharing the book synopsis, so like quoting it, or like explaining what the book is about in your own words. It's important to decide whether or not you want to engage in spoilers, like what happens in the book in detail beyond the synopsis. And if you do, please include a clear warning beforehand so folks can decide if they would rather just wait to read the book before returning to the review. A tip I would recommend is that you actually summarize the book without any spoilers first, and then very briefly explain what you thought about it, like a general thoughts and feelings, and then offer your a little spoiler alert tag or whatever it is, like little heads up to folks. That way people know I can I'm not into spoilers. I'm going to leave and then maybe come back later. And if they're okay with spoilers, they can keep going. But I recommend this method so that if people don't want to continue on to read the spoilers, at least now they know what your thoughts were on the book, because there's no guarantee someone's going to necessarily come back to that review after having read that book. Is it a book by a debut author and established author? Why is that important? Well, with each new book, the author experiences growth in their writing. So maybe you'll judge a debut different from an author who's written multiple books. This isn't something you have to do, but just an example of what I mean when I say context. It'll also depend on the book. I've reviewed books where it's like a debut author and I'm not necessarily feeling the book, but there are like very interesting things happening in the book. Like maybe I really like how they handle relationships, or maybe their craft is really interesting. And so there's enough in it for me to want to be curious about their second book, right? What their next book will look like. And so sometimes that may be, there's a little grace that you offer a debut author. And that's what I mean by that. Is it a format or genre or age category well, or that tends to be something you like? So what I mean by this is that if you're not really a poetry reader and you're going to review a poetry book, maybe that's something you disclose so that people know going in that it's from that perspective of someone who isn't well versed in this form. And it doesn't mean you can't read or talk about poetry, because ideally poets want everyone to read their work, but it'll offer the reader of your review an understanding of where you're coming from. So if, for example, if you're someone who's like a casual poetry reader and you really enjoyed this poetry collection, then a fellow casual poetry reader would be like, oh, okay, maybe this is something I'd be into. Another example is like romance novels. So romance novels promise their readers a happily ever after. So it wouldn't make sense for a reviewer to have an issue with a romance book having like a neat and happy ending. If neat and happy endings are not your bag, it's not something you're interested in, maybe don't read or don't review a romance book. There are other types of books that feature romance that maybe do something different with their endings and things like that. But essentially, this is an example of where you can have your thoughts and feelings about a romance book and be critical of it, but while also remaining fair, right? You can't really punish a book for doing what it's supposed to be doing. Another example is, there are adults who read young adult fiction. I am one of those adults. It is actually part of my job now. And something I see often in reviews by adults is when they complain about a book feeling too young. Which is odd given that the age category is 12 to 18 or 13 to 18. And so it's important to take note that you can criticize the book within the context of, does it work for this age category, and less so if it worked for you as an adult. I think that's something that we need to keep in mind and also kind of be fair in our reviews. Last example, comics, graphic novels, picture books are all very much about the marriage between art and words. So if you're going to review them, it's important to talk about the art as much as the words if you're going to talk about like very craft specific stuff. So, and also acknowledge people. So in the case of picture books, graphic novels, comics, sometimes you'll have someone who does everything, like from the writing all the way to the finished artwork, like they're all one, team. Or in some cases, you have someone who's a writer and someone who's an illustrator. And so anything nice you say about the illustration, be sure that you credit the illustrator and not necessarily credit the writer with every aspect of the book. And specifically for comics and graphic novels, you can actually break down the role of an artist even further. So you will have someone who does pencils. So they actually lay everything out, the art style, all of it. But for whatever reason, another person comes in as an inker, and their job is to ink out the pencils and everything, like clean it up. And then you have someone who's a colorist coming in separately to do the colors. And so they're in charge of that. And then you have someone who's a letterer, whose sole purpose on a book is to actually design the look of the text on the page. So if there's like a moment where there's like a boom sound effect on the page, they're the ones that are going to design boom to look like an explosion, as an example. And so if you have something like, you're like, oh wow, this comic has such beautiful colors, you want to ensure that if there is a separate colorist, that you give, like Henry the colorist did a fantastic job at that, versus attributing everything to, like, say, one of, like, someone else who didn't do it, or like a writer type of thing. Something to keep in mind. What worked or didn't work? So again, the point of a review is to tell people what you thought about it. So you want to talk about the ways in which it worked for you and or what didn't work. And finally, is this something you'd recommend? This is necessarily something you should always end it on, but you kind of want to wrap it up with some kind of insight as to where you fell with after spilling your entire thoughts and feelings on it. You want the review to have the reader understand this is how you felt about it, and even make a recommendation. So in some cases, you might be like, every single person should read this book, or you might put a caveat like, this book is very much for X group of people. So an example would be, The City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty is a fantastic book for, like, everyone in the fantasy genre, fantastic. Or you might be like, oh, The Time Traveler's Wife is a book for people who want to dip their toes in the world of speculative fiction, because it's not focused solely on that, and instead uses the elements of, the fantastical to actually focus more on, like, set in the real world, but it's more focused on the character pushes and conflict and things like that. So it's great for people like my friend Michelle, who likes contemporary work, and they can, like, dip their toe a bit into this fantasy realm. And star rating, yay or nay. So some reviewers like to incorporate a star rating, usually 1 to 5, with 5 being fantastic and 1 being I did not like it. And there are conversations around how useful that is. Everyone ascribes their own unique values to the star rating system. So someone can be like, a 3.5 could mean, it was fine. While someone else can be like, oh my gosh, they're like near perfection, with like some like little tweaks that need to be made for it to get to that 5 type of thing. And some people will get into the nitty gritty of the decimals. They'll be like, this book is a 3.75, while others are like, no, you're either a 2 or a 3. There are no like anything in between. And, if you're on places like reading tracking apps like Goodreads or Storygraph, the star rating system is alive and well there. Personally, I actually started off using the star rating system when I was a book blogger. And then as time passes, I found that it was really hard for me personally to kind of reduce a book to a star rating, especially because my star ratings, even within myself, wasn't always consistent. And I ended up ditching it. But it's great it depends on who you are, whether or not it's something that's helpful. So another thing to consider is, what's your review style? Everyone has their own style. The more you write, or, in the case of folks who are recording podcasts or YouTubes, the more you record, the more you'll develop your own style through trial and error. There are different approaches to reviewing a book. You can be someone who's interested in sharing only positive reviews. Your goal is only to like amplify books. You want as many people as possible to check out these really cool books that you were able to read. In some cases, you might be someone who will literally review every single book you've ever read. In other cases, you want to review maybe only books that elicited, like, got a really strong emotion from you, whether positive, negative, or maybe there's something very interesting within the book, like its themes or a really great craft-based thing that they've done. Another style aspect is focusing on whether or not you find a book enjoyable. So it's all about the feels. It's just about the feels. Or maybe it's about craft. You're like, oh, I really want to get in the nitty gritty about how this book was executed and the craft aspect of it as well. And this is not mutually exclusive. Within a single review, you can do both. Or you can have some books where you're like, I had so many great feelings about this book that I can't even like focus on craft because I just want to talk about the feelings, and vice versa. Like it's very, you can swim into all of these. You can do a personal essay style. So I've written a review where it's kind of like creative nonfiction, where a book I had read was so much in line with what I was going through at the time that I will, there's a review within it, but I'm using my personal experiences to kind of create this imagery and story while also explaining to people what this book is about and why I enjoyed it and what I thought it did really well. You can go the short and sweet route where it's very structured, where it's kind of like, synopsis, what worked, what didn't work, like recommending, and then a star rating type of thing. That's very snappy to the point, which could be great for people who really just want to go in, find out what you thought about the book and what this book is about, and get out type of thing. And then I wrote GIFs here, or GIFs, depending on who you are. I wrote GIFs here because it's a really fun, there are different ways in which you can instill your personality in a book review. So like in blog posts, I've seen people add like GIFs, where it's like, especially if you feel like, example, the GIF of like, I'm in a glass case of emotion for a book that's particularly like hitting you in all of the feelings and all of that. And if you look at like YouTube or TikTok or any of those places, they'll do really cool like editing tricks, or they'll do like skits. Like there are so many ways where you can really like make a book review really fun for yourself, but also fun for your readers. Are you the right person to review this book? So in 2014, there was like this big online movement and conversation called We Need Diverse Books, which led to the creation of the nonprofit of the same name. And it's now kind of, it's becoming normal for an author to ask themselves, is this a story I should be writing? And, or at least that's the expectation. And particularly if it involves a marginalized community. And so the entire publishing system, from like readers to publishers, very much have this idea of like diversity on their mind. And, I'm not going to talk about whether that, like, who's doing it successfully, if it's even successful, how far we've come since 2014. But what I will say, well, one, there are always conversations like these happening before 2014, but in particular, what happened in 2014 and the things afterwards really made it so that this conversation in publishing is now like inescapable, like for good or bad, like it's now something we all think about. And so that doesn't mean book reviewers are immune to this, right? Again, context. You need to ask yourself, is this a book I should be reviewing? Or are there aspects of this book that I can't really like comment on or speak on? This isn't to say you can't like review a book outside of your experience, because obviously marginalized authors would also like book reviewers to like prop up their work, talk about their work, discuss their work. But it is mindful about, but it is about you being mindful about what you're bringing into that reading experience, right? Again, context. That's why I started off with context, because you're offering context also to your readers and your watchers of your platform. You can also use the opportunity to spotlight reviews from that community. So an example is, because I read this book recently, Get a Life, Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert is a romance novel that features a disabled character. And I really enjoyed that book. However, if I was to write a review of it, I'm not going to necessarily be like, believe me, I know this, like it's best representation of like, a disabled character because I'm able-bodied. So instead I would, talk about everything else and then kind of go, if you want to know if this is a good representation or not, here's a review by a disabled book reviewer that you should check out. So it's a way in which, one, to engage in your community, and also like, prop up your fellow book reviewer in that way, kind of giving them acknowledgement as well. As a marginalized reviewer, your voice matters. This is something to think about, because I know there are likely marginalized folks who are watching this. Your voice matters. So and what do I mean by this? On one hand, you are not immune to the ills of the world, which includes, oppression, racism, etc. And so your voice matters in the sense that I've seen publishers now actually offer book review copies of a book to marginalized reviewers, especially if the author themselves is marginalized. They try to reach out to that marginalized community in the book review setting so that they have voices represented and can actually speak to that experience if it is being acknowledged. But also in terms of access, I've seen access to things like ARCs, which we'll get into, be an issue of conversation before, in terms of marginalized reviewers not getting access to ARCs or not being part of blogger communities and blogger programs at publishing houses. And so I know that was a big conversation that was being had. Also, as a marginalized reviewer, you may want to call out something that is like racist or whatever, and just know that, there might be people who will push up against that, especially if they're not from your community, and just know that your voice very much does matter and is needed in the community. And finally, what makes a really good book review? Well, you want to read and or watch other reviewers. You, in the same way that what they'll say to writers in terms of how to improve on your craft is to read, like really it's just to read more. If you want to improve on your writing craft in terms of writing book reviews, read or watch other reviewers, see what works and what doesn't work, and kind of learn from that and imply and use it in your own work. Not necessarily like plagiarize, but more so in terms of you'll actually know for yourself what you think is good and bad, right? And I think that's very important for a book reviewer. Is there a cost to being a book reviewer? There shouldn't be. Like, that's the short answer. There shouldn't be. I started out reviewing books while using the books I borrowed from the library, which is an amazing resource. I didn't really buy books in the early days of my book blog because I was a university student. And also at the rate that I was reading, it wasn't like financially feasible to buy all of the books. And so you don't have to. And so that's why the public library and school library, if you're a student at high school or even university, is really important. I'm lucky that I live in Toronto, and so the Toronto Public Library is an amazing, massive system. And also that leads to the fact that you don't need to read the newest books for you to be a book blogger, right? You don't need to necessarily access the newest books. You can read backlist titles, older titles, and review them, because one, it's great practice, but also they might have been under the radar when they first came out. And so it's a great way for people to know a book exists. And also it might be like, you might have a very interesting perspective on it as well. If a book publisher wants you to review a book, or say a website print publication asks you to review a book, they should be the ones offering you a copy, whether it's a digital or physical copy. Or in the case of a website print publication, they should be the ones to arrange to have the publisher send you a copy. So for example, if the Toronto Star is like, hey, Ardo, can you review this book? They'll be the ones who actually go to the publisher for a review copy and ensure that it gets it to me. Like, they're the ones in charge of handling all of that. You shouldn't be paying out of pocket for books if someone comes up to you and says, hey, can you review this? Publishers have advanced copies of their books. So if you ever heard the term ARC, this is what they mean, or what people mean when they say ARC, advanced reader and or reviewer copy. And what this essentially means is publishers will have advanced copies of a book ahead of its publication that usually gets sent to reviewers as a way to create buzz and get people talking about a book ahead of its release or during the time it first gets released. If a publisher sends you a copy of an ARC or a book, sometimes they'll send a finished copy. It doesn't mean they expect you to give a positive review. So don't feel at all pressured to want to do that. there is no expectations on their end. They just expect you to read the book and have thoughts. Bad, good, doesn't matter. They obviously hope it's good, but that's not your business to like be PR for the publisher. For you, it's about you and how you feel. So, give your honest opinion. How do you get an ARC, which is something I know a lot of people ask about, or establish a relationship with the publisher? Well, it's as simple as emailing them. I recommend reaching out to a publisher, once you've put some time into your blog, partly because you don't want to deal with the pressures of people now, like a publisher knowing you exist, when you really haven't gotten into the groove of what your blog is. So, you want to grow, you want to, figure out who you are as a book reviewer. But it's also important because you're going to have to end up sending, examples of your work to a publisher. So when you do reach out to them, make sure that you're essentially pitching yourself to them, right? You want to tell them who you are, examples of your work, the types of books you're interested in reviewing, your readership or viewership numbers. So like what, people who are actually engaging in your work, and like checking it out, and social media followers, anything that you think would make it seem really cool for them to like, oh, maybe I should send books to them so they can review it. And in some cases, a publisher will actually maybe reach out to you because they've come across you, and for whatever reason, whether it's like they like your style or they think you have a really big platform, or maybe you're from an area that they're like, oh, we need more people from like, I don't know, Northern Ontario, whatever it is. They'll reach out to you and say, hey, do you want to be part of our blogger program? Or sometimes they'll be like, hey, do you want us to, can we send you this very specific kind of book? Platforms. So there are actually many ways for you to be a book reviewer. So if, for example, you want to write long form reviews, blog posts are the way to go. WordPress, Medium, Tumblr are all just some of like the free platforms, blogging platforms out there. And I recommend WordPress in particular, since it's what I've been using for the last 10 years. It works for me. It might not necessarily work for you. And honestly, a free account is more than enough. I'm sure there's other platforms. I actually don't know. There have been a lot of platforms that have existed and kind of died, but there's always a free way to do this. And honestly, it's free. A free account is more than enough, especially if you're not getting paid to do this. A YouTube channel is also an option. So like the BookTube community is super big and thriving. You can record using your phone, right? You don't necessarily need a fancy camera, and then maybe invest in editing software. I'm not too familiar as a YouTuber type of, because I don't really do that. I started doing it for Fold Kids to talk about Fold Kids Book of the Month, but I don't know if there are actually free editing software. So maybe that's something you think about, but it is quite a bit of work in terms of, setting up and the recording experience and then editing. So that's an option. And also it's like a longer form of recording. So you'll have videos that range from like 8 minutes to like 30 minutes to an hour. Instagram. So Instagram's really cool. Books are just beautiful to photograph, whether it's a physical copy, audiobooks. There are people who do a really great job of how to like photograph an audiobook experience, with like, the image of a phone with earbuds, things like that, or like an ebook. And then within the description, they'll have their review. And if you are so interested in doing like short recordings, Instagram has the reel option. Then we have TikTok. TikTok has actually exploded during pandemic, especially, and the book talk community is huge. In fact, it's actually led to some backlist titles, so titles published in the past, to sell out a ton of copies and actually end up on the New York Times bestsellers list. So that's amazing. That's an example of like a book review making an impact. And it's much shorter than YouTube. It's free. You can actually record and also edit all on the app. So it's maybe a little easier if there isn't like a free editing software, like that's something you can do, similar to Instagram Reels as well. Next, we have Twitter. Now, Twitter, I don't often see Twitter used as a reviewing platform. I just threw it up there in case someone want to innovate Twitter. As you can see here, I attempted to start a reading thread for 2021 of books I want people to know about, pre-order, maybe add it to their list. And then by March, I just ended up failing epically and just haven't kept up with it. But that's an option. And then you have, reading tracking apps. So Goodreads, Litzy, Storygraph, etc. are all a great way to kind of like dip your toes before embarking on a book review journey. So maybe it's more casual for you. Although even on Goodreads, because a lot of publishers kind of, look at it and use it as well, because it's the oldest. Storygraph is actually pretty new, and it's, I think, created by it's Black owned, I believe. But you can actually be like, I want to write serious reviews just on these apps. And you can definitely do that. And then finally, podcasting. So there are podcasting, podcasts dedicated to like talking about books as well. So that's an option. It can get kind of pricey. I'm sure there are free ways to go about it. Like you can download Audacity for recording audio, in terms of like, and then you can kind of add it onto your website. So it actually you can make it free, having the audio appear on your blog, for example. So that's an option. There have been people who did like, no video podcasts on YouTube as well. So something to consider. And of course, you want to share your reviews with everyone, right? You've taken this time to like craft this review and you want everyone to know about it. So if you have other platforms, that's where you can share it with, right? On social media, everywhere you want to share. However, sharing is great, but do not, under any circumstance, tag an author in a negative review. It's just a general etiquette, a small kindness to not tag them in a negative review. And I say social media on here, but I also mean like, also don't email your negative review. Some reviewers actually go as far as saying that they don't want to even like share tag authors in a positive review. And that's partly because they don't want to be perceived. They don't necessarily want like the attention of the author either way. And it's fair because the review is not really for them. It's for other readers to like check it out. But in terms of negative reviews, please, if there's anything you take out of this, do not tag an author in a negative review. So getting paid for reviews. So there are some ways you can go about this in terms of getting something out of your reviews. Sponsors. So I see this more in terms of TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. People getting paid via sponsors. So a sponsor might reach out and say, hey, I see that you have a lot of viewers. Can you, talk, do your regular video, but during that video, please mention our product and we'll send it to you for free so you can like share your product. But they'll also like actually get paid money out of it. And another thing I forgot actually is there's some platforms that actually allow for like ad revenue. So like on YouTube, they have like a creators program where I'm sure there's like up to a certain point of viewers. I don't know the details of it, but you can actually like, they'll run ads on your videos and you'll actually get like money out of that. So something to think about. And I think it's like based on like viewership or something like that. Another way is like volunteer in exchange for something meaningful. So what I say by this is because the reality is, in order for you to get to the position to actually get paid for your work, it's annoying, but sometimes you need to be in a space where you kind of do things for free. Even like for me, doing my blog post as a blogger, like it's my own platform, all of that, it was for free, right? I wasn't necessarily getting paid for it. But I also wrote for sites that were not paying me in my early days. And honestly, even as I got paid for other opportunities, I kind of stayed with them because of my relationship to them. And I really enjoyed the people there. But I recommend if you are writing for a place that isn't going to pay you, please, like, I personally think if it's entirely volunteer run from the top to the bottom, I prefer that more because a really good platform is one that will prioritize paying their contributors. Like if any kind of income that they get from this site should first and foremost maybe go to like, paying for the domain and like the actual physical website upkeep. But then secondarily, before even paying for themselves, they should be paying contributors. because I've seen situations where people got taken advantage of. But if you are in a situation where every single person is volunteering, there's other ways in which you can get a meaningful exchange out of it that's not necessarily like actual money. So opportunities, you might have someone like a festival. I'm going to use a Fold, for example. If you're like a Instagrammer or influencer that we want you to come and attend like the festival and like talk about the festival and all of that, but we're nonprofit, so our finances are limited, then what we would do would probably like offer you like free access to the festival, goodie bags, like a whole bunch of stuff, so that, and if it's in person, I assume also like maybe paying for your travel and things like that. But you want to make sure that the experience of attending doesn't result in you actually paying things out of pocket, if that makes sense. And then I wrote skill here because when I wrote for Women Write About Comics, what was great is I got an opportunity to be edited by people, so my writing improved. But more specifically, it was a great community because the editor-in-chief at the time would actually share opportunities with everyone. So they'll be like, this is I saw this free workshop on like social media that I think you guys will all like. And so they'll share things and opportunities that come up to where the end point is that you'll benefit from it. They'll even share paid opportunities as well, right? That kind of thing. I got a chance to actually do the back end social media stuff for the site for a short little bit to gain experience on tweeting for brand. So things like that. That's what I mean in terms of volunteer in exchange for something meaningful. You ultimately, if you're doing something for free, which if you can avoid it, obviously, but if you're going to do something for free, make sure that you're ultimately getting something out of it, like something meaningful out of it. And exposure is not enough, right? Exposure is not enough because you are putting labor into it. And finally, pitching. So there are two ways in which you can get paid at an actual publication. You can apply and actually join on as like a staff writer or ongoing reviewer, and they'll pay you in that way. Or you can just do freelance. So you can pitch a very specific idea to a platform, and they'll be like, this sounds great. And then, you'll get paid for that particular, review. So that's a way to go about it as well. So you're a book blogger, and or book reviewer, and part of the reason why you got into book reviewing is, yeah, you're a reader, but in some cases you actually eventually want to get into the book industry. Now, first and foremost, as a book reviewer, you are already part of the book industry. You're a part of the ecosystem in terms of the book industry, in the same way that literary festivals are, in the same way that book sellers are. You're part of that ecosystem, right? You matter because you help elevate and promote and amplify books, right? Because without you, people won't necessarily know a book exists. So you are important. That being said, there are people who actually want to do one of two things: either become an author or actually write or actually work under a publisher. And so what you kind of want to know, and I've had friends, tell me if they were a new blog reviewer, this is something they'd want to know, is what happens if you continue writing reviews as an author or publishing professional, and whether or not you should do that. Well, you could be someone who only shares positive reviews. So maybe you get a job in publishing, or maybe you're an author. And so now if you want to still talk about books, maybe you focus on positive reviews. You're only going to talk about books you enjoyed. You're not going to talk about books you didn't enjoy. Another way you can do this is you avoid talking about books that were published by your publisher. So if you're working as an editor, a publicist, even an intern, whatever it is, and you work for, say, Penguin Random House Canada, then you're going to maybe talk about every other book but Penguin Random House authors. You're like, I'm not going to talk about any books published by that publisher. Now, I don't recommend this route per se, because if you work for a multinational company, this is very difficult to do, because they publish a great deal of books. Like the 4 or 5 publishers, I actually don't know what the number is because they're like merging every other year, but they eat up a great portion of books being published. So I wouldn't go that route, because then you'll probably have a bunch of books you won't be able to talk about. But if you do end up talking about books by the publisher, that you work for or write for, or you also want to, share positive reviews only, be sure to add a disclaimer. So especially for publishing professionals who work on, like, I don't know, Penguin Canada's social media, or you're an editor, whatever it is, be sure to let people know that you're an employee there when you're reviewing one of those titles, because then people can do with that information what they will, right? If they want to be someone who takes it with a grain of salt, they can do that. For some people, it doesn't matter to them, but you should do a disclaimer because you want your credibility to be intact. And as an author in general, it's kind of different because this is your peers. And so I honestly recommend maybe sharing only positive reviews. So something to think about. Also, if you're a book reviewer ahead of applying to a publishing job, it's important to be careful with your language in your reviews. And what I mean by this is not to tone police you. If you did not like a book, you did not like a book, but be careful about using incendiary like wording and phrases and things like that. Like, you don't want to like talk about a typo in a book and say something like, this proofreader should be fired, because now you're entering a space in which that proofreader might be working at the place you want to apply to, or that maybe someone someone at the publishing company saw that and like, oh, I don't know if we can work with someone who would say something like that, because the reality is everyone's kind of working really hard behind the scenes. And so to say something like that is not necessarily great. And guess what? It's also not necessary to say in your review. And I mentioned this because there are review types where, people like to be a bit like fun with their language. And so if you ever want to pursue like working within the industry, that's something to take note of. And lastly, what I'll say about book reviewing and being a book reviewer is to have fun. If you're not having fun, it's not a fun experience to not have fun. In 2016, I actually reached an emotional point where, through like a bunch of like mental health situations where the idea of reviewing was like a lot. And I actually stopped writing reviews, and it was so much better for my mental health. And so, always check in with yourself and see if this is something that's still fun for you to engage with. So yeah, that is essentially a how-to on book reviews. I'm going to start taking questions. So I'm going to give you guys some time to do that while I clean up the Q&A, because you lovely people did let me know if you could hear me. So I'm just going to clean this up while this is happening, just so that I know, so that I can actually see your lovely questions. So again, this is a perfect time for you to send in your questions for the next 15 minutes. So yeah. Alrighty, so I'm gonna look to see. Okay, so Nicola asks, can you recommend a good source for understanding what defines specific genres? Example, what constitutes speculative fiction? And thank you so much about the kind words for the webinar. That's very interesting. I'm sure I don't have particular recommendations in terms of genre. I do think this is another reason why reading and or watching other book reviews are great, because especially if they do a range of like genre type things, because then you can it's kind of that thing where you just learn by osmosis as you experience it. So for example, speculative fiction is just anything weird, right? Anything weird. If there's dragons, if, I like to use Time Traveler's Wife because it's a story in which a man time travels, but you never know, you're never told, and it's not a spoiler, you will never know how he can do it. The story is not interested in the mechanics of time travel. What it's interested in is using time travel as a way to create character, like create conflict and character dynamics and things like that. So that's still speculative fiction, even though because of how it's written or books like it, I would use, in books like it, it's very like literary fiction. Like you have books that are kind of like teetering. So yeah, I like to say speculative fiction is anything like weird and not normal that happens there, right? So anything from hardcore second world fantasy, science fiction, even magical realism would be under the speculative umbrella. But yeah, honestly, if you read a lot and you watch and read other book reviewers, I think that's a great way to figure out like how the genre breakdown is. And honestly, and I say that because as a romance, I wasn't really a romance reader. And so it wasn't until I started reading romance and like reading romance reviewers that I actually understood the mechanics or like the understanding people go into with romance. So like the happy ending is like a given, or a happily ever after for now type of thing. Okay, next question. I'm curious about your thoughts in reviewing other writers when you're a writer yourself. I've heard much discussion on how writers should avoid saying anything negative, even if constructive, because you may work with the writer in future. There have also been some controversies about reviews on Goodreads. I used to rate every book I read there based on my enjoyment, but now I'm not sure what to do when I don't love a book. What do you do? And what best practices do you recommend for other writers? So I kind of touched on that. I listen, personally, because I work in literary festivals as well, so I actually got to see the back end of things. You never know when you're going to be in a green room with someone, when you're going to be on a panel with someone, and it's just really hard to like engage with anyone after you've said something negative, even if constructive. I mean, listen, you do you, but it will avoid a lot of heartache and like awkward situations if you avoid negative reviews. If you want to do, I know that in some reading tracking apps, you can kind of set up your account as like private. So you can still just for yourself or just for your friends, kind of like review books however you like. And that's a way to go. But yeah, I would go more on the positive route of things. If you're just a reader in general and you're not sure about like whether you should negatively review a book, go like it's up to you. You're the reader, and this is how you feel. But if you're talking about it as like someone who wants to be an author or is an author, it becomes a bit tricky. So yeah. In a review, is it recommended to mention that it was an arc that was read? I know when I was doing it, it was kind of common practice to do it. I think it's safer to mention that you, and what the disclaimer tends to be for book reviews is that, and I'm trying to remember if it's necessarily at the beginning or the end. I don't think it necessarily matters, but you kind of say something along the lines of, I got this book. This is an advanced reader copy or an arc that I got from the publisher in exchange for an honest review. Something along those lines. It's helpful. I think wherever you can, if you can disclose whatever you can during your review, it's recommended. It's also a way that journalists do things as well. And it's because you want to avoid, it's not necessarily like a conflict of interest that it actually exists, but even the appearance of one, you kind of want to avoid. So disclosing, I highly recommend. And you know what? It might be like overkill by doing it, but you know, it never hurts, right, to do that. So yeah, I used to do that quite a bit on my book blog, so I highly recommend that. I review for a literary journal. Should I be sending links to the reviews to the publishers? Yes. I feel like if you have a positive review of a book, oh yeah, you know what, you're right. Yes. So because I forgot about this, if you wrote a really lovely review about a book, like a positive review about a book, especially after getting an arc from an no, let me set two different things. You wrote a positive review of a book, right? You send that to the publisher. You can tag a publisher in a positive review, and then that way they can share your review, right? And that's great for you because more people get to see your review. That 100% do that because it's promotion, and they'll feel motivated to share your review. They're not going to share necessarily a negative review either, right? Unless it's really thoughtful. Like it depends on the publisher, but for the most part, I think you're better off with a positive review. in general, if you got an ARC from a publisher, they usually want to have you send a copy of your review to them after you wrote it and published it, to send it to them, because then you've shown them that you've written about this book after getting an ARC, and they'll know, okay, I can keep sending this person an ARC because they seem to be using the ARC. And this is both positive or negative, right? So if they're sending you an ARC hoping you'll review it and you end up reviewing it regardless of if it's positive or negative, then email them and send them a link to that review. So yeah, if it's a blog post or a literary journal, if it's a positive review, definitely send that link to publishers. Can I give an idea of an acceptable fee for paid reviews? Oh, I don't know. It's bit, I don't know. It ranges. I would do it by the number of words that you have. For example, if you're doing anything over 500-600 words and you're only getting $50, that's not great. If you're doing more of like that personal essay style thing I was telling you about, that's more intensive, maybe I would say maybe like 200, 250. You'll gauge, you essentially want the cost to kind of reflect how much time you put into it, right? If you have like a nice short review, then maybe like 100 would make sense. It really depends on how long the review is. But for example, I wouldn't pay someone $50 and then have them offer me like a 600, 700, 800 word review. Like that's, and also might depend on the place. They might do like 1 cent for every word. So I don't really know what an acceptable fee would be, but if it feels like you're yeah, again, like that's an example, like the $50 thing. Like I don't think that's at all acceptable. I would actually maybe pay someone $200 for a written review, maybe 200, 250 at least. Yeah. And for book, and I won't speak to booktubers or any of that because I personally don't do it, and I don't know what would be considered acceptable. All right. Kathy wants to know, what about including book reviews in your author's webpage? You can do that. You can, because some author websites have like a blog within their website, and that's where you can, put book reviews. I know of authors like E.K. Johnson, who's actually a Canadian young adult author. She's really lovely because she'll write like really fun reviews. I don't know if she writes it for her site, but she'll write like really lovely things about like on Twitter or anything like that, and will really like shout out books that she really enjoys. So you can be someone like that where you'll do that. And yeah, authors tend to have blogs within their author website where it can be a blog about books you've been enjoying, or like just about your life type of thing. So yeah, you can definitely include it in your author page as like a separate tab. Is it possible to be too uncritical? I only write positive reviews because I'm a librarian encouraging readers to try something, but I wonder if I should highlight flaws. Only have 200 words though. Oh, that's a really good question. So it's funny you say that because I started my book blog in 2012. And so at the time I was not in the publishing industry. Now I technically am. And I, as working for Fold. And for me, what I decided when people come up to me and ask, can you review for our site or can you do this? My stipulation is I only want to positively review books because I want my job, even outside of the festival, to be an amplification of a book. I always want to bring books up. And if a book is something I didn't like, maybe someone else liked it. So that was my focus. And obviously I try to highlight marginalized people as well. And so I think it depends. I think if there's a book where you enjoy it, but you do find something, an issue with it, you can mention it. There's always a really nice, a kind way to do it. And I think it also depends on what your role is. So librarian, etc. Although I do feel like a librarian can also kind of do both. I don't know. But I will say a positive review doesn't make it any less meaningful, right? Because again, there are so many books, like you have no idea for the pitches I get for Fold Kids alone. And I'm focusing on Canadian kidlit titles for 2022. The amount of books I get, there's so many. There's so many that I personally won't be able to get through. And so for you to write a positive review does not mean you're not a critical thinker. It just means that you're focusing on books that you want other people to know exist. Because that's the biggest thing for whether or not a book does well is people knowing it exists, the marketing of it, right? And so if you really enjoyed a book, shout it out into the ether. Let every person know how much you enjoyed this book, and it's still meaningful, still meaningful. When have you been assigned to review a book, but you didn't love it? And what was the best thing to focus on to provide a successful review? Oh, wow. Okay, so I had a situation in which in the early days of my blogging situation where I've been asked to review a book, and I think it was a self-published book. I was asked to review a book and I said, great, I'll try to review this book, but just so you know, it's going to be an honest review. And I was honest. I was definitely honest about it. If there are good things about the book, mention it, right? It might not 100% be awful, right? For example. So if there are good things to talk about, I wouldn't say force it, right? To force mentioning something you enjoyed about the book or thought the book did well. But if you're doing a negative review and you happen to find something that's natural, mention it, right? It's always nice to mention what does work, right? It's helpful. But I think, yeah, if it's how you feel, it's how you feel. And I think people need to respect that. But I think, but I want you guys to know that a successful review is what constitutes a successful review is you understand that you're being fair to it. So again, like with the romance idea, like if it has a happy, it's if you don't like a happy ending and the whole point of romance is a happy ending, then don't, go after it for that. But if you're being fair, if you feel that you're being fair, that you're being mindful and considerate, and that the actual issues you have with it are things that are constructive, or even situating it so that you're like, for me personally, I did not enjoy this aspect of it. It doesn't appeal to me. For example, if you're someone who likes a friends to lovers trope, but this is a enemies to lovers, you can be like, that's not something I'm into. But I'm sure people who are into it might enjoy this. As long a successful review is one where you thought about the book, that you have put thought into it, that you're honest with your feelings, that you're constructive with it, regardless of whether or not it's a positive review or a negative review. So Bonnie says, very lovely things about this workshop. Thank you. I'm wondering about content advisories, trigger warnings. It's something that's prevalent in theater shows. Is it also becoming a part of book reviewing? Yes, I know that back even when I was in like reviewing in 2012, 13, all of that, there was a big conversation around trigger warnings. And some people argue about if that constitutes as a spoiler, and other people have argued that if a book features rape, that shouldn't necessarily be a plot point that makes or breaks your book, essentially. I do think trigger warnings can be helpful, because if a book, for example, trigger warning, deals with suicide, it's important to, I think it is something that you want to mention in case there are people who are not in a place to really handle that topic, especially if it's not obvious in the book. I've read and even watched shows where something happens, like maybe a sexual assault scene or something like that, and it just comes out of nowhere, and I'm not emotionally prepared for it, and I'm like, oh my god, this really just derailed my entire feelings about this piece of work. So if you want, you can definitely, I encourage trigger warnings if it's like very specific kinds of things, like sexual assault, suicide, these kinds of things that really trigger people. And I'm starting to see books actually do that at the beginning of a book, where they'll give people a heads up, be kind to yourself, just know that something like this is going to take place. Yes, the recording of this webinar will be available and accessed at a later date. You said don't tag the author. What do you mean by that? So this is in the space of the social media world. So like on Twitter, Instagram, etc. Adding the writer is just, that at sign. So like the A with like the loop around, where if you want a particular person to see what you've written, like a tweet, an Instagram post, whatever it is, or even if in the case of Instagram, you can actually go to the back end and like tag them so that when they see an image, their name pops up. I think you do that on Facebook as well, where you can tag someone on an image or anything like that and see their name pop up. That actually signifies to the person you're tagging that you've been mentioned in something. And so you'll go and then wonder, okay, what have I been mentioned in? So that's what I mean by tagging. And so what you don't want to do is say, you're sharing your review on Twitter and you're like, I'll use JL as an example. Like, oh, I actually did love Gutter Child, disclaimer. But hey, at JL Richardson, her handle, I reviewed at JL Richardson's latest book, Gutter Child, and here's my review. In some case, people will like foreshadow that they didn't like the book in that tweet. In other cases, it's up to the author to like click on and discover, oh, wow, this is not a positive review. It's actually an incredibly negative review. And so JL, if I had added her in that conversation, as opposed to just writing her name, she'll know about that tweet and then we'll want to click on the link and then we'll see that it's a negative review. So that's what I mean by don't tag the author. You can just say, I read JL Richardson's Gutter Child, and you can, click on the link to see what I thought about it, and you can just type it out. And that way she won't be forced to know the existence of this review. If she wants to go out of her way to see if anyone's reviewed her book, she can always look up her name in the search engine within a social media platform or on Google. And then that's up to the author to like, if they want to find it themselves, great for them. So that's what I mean by tagging. What are some of the venues, forums, strategies to connect with communities of other book reviews, other than Fold, of course? What I did actually, because for me, my primary source of community when I was actively, heavily as a book blogger was Twitter. And so you kind of find, it's kind of like, it's like a slow process of finding it. So you'll like start off by following publishers, and then publishers will retweet other people, and like you'll start to like find people. You can also like Google like book reviews, things like that, and like people will come up. Same with like, for example, if you search book reviews on YouTube or TikTok or any of that, that's how you'll find it. It's a lot of like, community building takes a while. So don't feel like as soon as this workshop's over, you're like, I need to find someone right this moment. It'll take some time. That's how I casually grew, and the people that I knew and ended up being really great friends with through the book community. And so a lot of it is just finding it. I know TikTok's a bit harder because unless you have like a direct link, or maybe you just look up book reviews, you can find people, but a lot of it is just the algorithm, right? And also if you're friends, ask your friends, ask the people like book readers, who are you reading in terms of book reviews, and get recommendations that way. But yeah, there are a ton of cool people out there. Are there courses for book reviewers to learn how to read more intelligently? For example, learning about tropes. No, I mean, technically speaking, so it's a combination. So technically speaking, you can go to like a creative writing course and learn about like, craft, but also genre and things like that. Things like tropes are actually very much an online thing. So like friends to lovers, all of that is things you'll naturally come across the more you, again, read other booktubers and reviewers and things like that. And again, the more you're reading as a book reviewer, the more books you read, the more you'll grow as a reviewer. You'll naturally come across this in terms of understanding of tropes and things like that. And there are also, I'm sure if you like Google like romance tropes or what are the genres in books, you can actually, there's so much at your fingertips in terms of the internet. So a lot of it is just trial and error. I don't really have like specific places to go to, and I don't usually recommend like you should go and do an undergrad in creative writing, or like, the UFT summer course that they have on creative writing. Because I don't think you need to necessarily pay for a program for you to actually do it. And I'm sure there's also probably free ways to also like get this kind of, maybe Eventbrite does events, if you look it up, like book reviews, or book and see what comes up. But yeah, a lot of it is just slowly building and watching other people do it. How long should the review be? Listen, reviews can be as long or short as you want. I've seen people do like 2,000 word reviews, and I've seen people do a very succinct, like 100 words less review. It's all up to you. You can go as long or as short as you want. Obviously, in some cases, like, there are best practices for the different formats. But if you're engaging and you're interested in what you're talking about and you're feeling yourself and you're having a lot of fun, the format, like, we live in a world where you can play with format, like, and have fun with it. Would you be able to recommend any places online, such as forums, for example, where people from certain marginalized backgrounds can discuss books, book reviews, or marginalized authors? For example, if you have a disability, or non-binary, BIPOC, etc. Oh man. Oh, well, okay. So I'm going to recommend the site that I used to write for. Women Write About Comics, in terms of, they do like comic reviews, book reviews, and also like TV and show reviews. But even though it says Women Write About Comics, that's how it started out as, but they mostly refer to themselves as WWAC. But it's a space in which you have like non-binary folks, BIPOC, trans-masc folks, essentially cisgendered men, writing about like really cool pop culture stuff, which does include books. So you can check them out. Is there anything else? There's so many, like, honestly, whenever, like, it's the same thing. If you look at other reviewers and things like that, you'll start to see, like, if you see a YouTuber, find out what their Twitter is, their Instagram, all of that, and then see who they're following, and essentially kind of like a 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon type of thing, because then you can start to see how everyone's connected, and you're like curating your community as well by doing so. But I guess I would recommend WWAC as like a great start in terms of that. But you'll naturally, like, a lot of the real life friends that I have came out of book blogging. Like, all of my best friends are because we've got to know each other online as book bloggers. Are there many book reviews on older books, or are most books that just come out? Yes, they tend to be newer books, because if it's a massive book that's coming out, like a new Malcolm Gladwell, it's a great way to improve your search engine SEO, and like get people to look at it, because they're like, oh, I want to know about the new Malcolm Gladwell. So I recommend, if you want to kind of, what you can do is you can kind of do a one new book for every like 5 older titles type of thing. But I do think older titles can be very useful, especially if you're really being thoughtful and like really dig deep into it. But yeah, always there's books. I'm trying to think of a book that people still talk about. Like, people still talk about N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth series. And so if you wanted to review that series, that's still beneficial to them. And the other part of that question is it useful to review older books that may or may not still be in print? That's a good question. I find if it's no longer in print, it's a bit harder to get other people to read it, or maybe you'll frame it as a way of like, this is a really cool thing that used to exist, and this is what it was about, and you can maybe even do a deeper dive, and maybe the spoiler take on that book is actually more meaningful because so many people can't actually access it anymore. So that's a take that you can go with. If I'm an author requesting the review and sending the ARC, how far in advance before release should I send the ARC for review? I would say maybe like at least 2 months, maybe 2 months. But honestly, even if you send like an advanced review with the understanding that you're not going to necessarily change anything as a result of it, even when your book comes out, you should still send a copy to the book reviewer. And then they can, because what I've heard from authors is, yes, the build up to the release is important, but what people find also is that once you got that release week or 2 weeks, they tend to fall off in terms of marketing and like people actually knowing about the book, or even 6 months later. And so if you want to keep that momentum up, you can even send it to them after the book has been published. But I would be mindful of how slow people could possibly read. So maybe 2 months. Oh man, I can only answer one more before we leave. I'm going to talk about this one because this one, okay, quickly, hashtagging. Hashtagging definitely for Instagram, Twitter, not for Facebook, maybe TikTok, I'm not sure, and not really for YouTube. Hashtagging is great because that's where, if you go to Bookstagram on Instagram, for example, it's a great way to actually find other Bookstagram folks as well. So hashtags are great in terms of finding other people who are doing the same thing that you're doing, the book's hashtag, etc. Am I the only one getting very intimidated when I review a book and hate it when everyone else seems to love it? Nope. Sometimes I take pride in that because if everyone loves it and I didn't like it, I'm like, hey, I got a unique perspective. And you know what? I might not be alone. So definitely, it feels intimidating, but also like speak your truth. And there's always going to be an audience for your review as well. To include a bit of negativity, perhaps say, honestly, I would have appreciated a bit more description of X or a bit more of an explanation of X. Is that good? Yes. I think if you're providing grace in your critiques by saying, you know, being specific in why it didn't work for you and saying, you know, it would have been, I would have liked to know more about this and that, I think is a great way to frame a negative review. So that's it. This is the end. I'm going a little over, but thank you so much for attending this workshop. I wasn't sure how this was going to go, but you guys are very engaging and asked really great questions. I want to give you a heads up that there's one more Fold Academy workshop that will be taking place. So I'm going to announce it here. You're the first to hear it. But Chloe Gong is actually, who is our teen writer in residence at this year's Fold 2022, is actually doing a workshop on April 9th at 12 p.m. It's called, what is it called? Let me double check what it is called because it's an excellent title. And it will be taking place at noon. It's called Shaking, Sobbing, Screaming, Ships in Young Adult Science Fiction with Chloe Gong is what it's called. So if you want to look at that particular genre and the relationship building that you can do within that genre, I highly recommend signing up for that, which you can do right now if you go to thefoldcanada.org. And yeah, thank you so much again for joining me for this workshop. And I hope you guys all have a fantastic and wonderful day. There will be a recording of this for you to go back and enjoy. And yeah, see ya.